Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Wednesday, 30 October 2024. It is the 131st anniversary of the birth of Jan Marius Romein, who was born in Rotterdam on this date in 1893. Romein was a Dutch historian and a student of Johann Huizinga, who I have mentioned in several episodes. Like many of the other figures I've discussed, Romein was a Marxist, but he wasn't a doctrinaire Marxist, so he exhibited some independence of mind. I suspect that Romein's Marxism made him more sympathetic than most historians to cultural evolutionism and to the idea that there could be regularities or laws or patterns in human history. You can call them laws if you like, but laws of history are even more unwelcome among most historians than cultural evolutionism. In a 1937 essay titled The Dialectics of Progress, Romein himself formulated a law, the law of the handicap of a head start, also called first mover disadvantage. The first mover should have a disadvantage rather than an advantage sounds counterintuitive from an economic point of view. But the historian takes a broader view than economics, and so he sees cases in which apparent early advantage turn out to be a later disadvantage. If you're first to market with a revolutionary new horse collar and you therefore thereafter dominate the market, but you do this as horse-drawn carriages are being replaced by automobiles, then your first mover advantage isn't going to help you much in the long term. Worse, you've sunk your capital into a declining infrastructure, and you may never get it back again, which can prevent you from effectively competing in whatever new markets appear after that time. Romein would go on to develop a more theoretical conception of history, which he in fact called theoretical history. He gave an exposition of this in his 1946 paper, Theoretical History, translated into English in 1948. There are at least a couple more papers by Romein that have been translated into English and which are relevant to his conception of theoretical history, but I haven't yet managed to get copies of these. So what I have to say is today is based only on this one paper, Theoretical History, and when I eventually get copies of the other papers, I may do this episode over or record an addendum or otherwise revisit Romein on the basis of the additional sources. So this episode may be a little thin given my lack of materials, but I wanted to at least acknowledge Romein's contribution to historical thought since it strikes me as being distinctive and interesting. In several earlier episodes, I've talked about the need to map the conceptual space of history. This can be framed in terms of what Donald Davidson called logical geography. Quote, much of the interest in logical form comes from an interest in logical geography. To give the logical form of a sentence is to give its logical location in the totality of sentences, to describe it in a way that explicitly determines what sentences it entails and what sentences it is entailed by. The location must be given relative to a specific deductive theory, so logical form itself is relative to a theory, unquote. That's from Donald Davidson's Essays on Actions and Events. Before Davidson, Wittgenstein had written about logical space in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, section 3.4, where he said, quote, the proposition determines a place in logical space, unquote. Whether we frame the problem in terms of logical geography or logical space, this hasn't been done in any kind of thorough way for history, which reflects the impoverished conceptual framework of history. For example, J.G.A. Pocock made a careful tripartite distinction among three different activities that are all called historiography, but it's difficult even to convey the distinction because of the lack of sharply defined concepts in history. But historians are always grasping after some better expression of what they're trying to do, even if many or most of these attempts are unsuccessful. Romein, in proposing what he called theoretical history, can be counted among those who are grasping at a distinct kind of history that even today seems elusive. Theoretical history occupies a distinct place on the conceptual map of history, related to, but not the same as, historiography, philosophy of history, or history properly speaking. Romein himself gives us the location of theoretical history in the conceptual geography of history. Quote, let us briefly imagine theoretical history as a central square, surrounded on its four sides, A, by what in the 18th century was sometimes called theoretical history, B, by what nowadays is known as philosophy of history, C, by the technique of historical research, which is often miscalled historical method, D, and finally by what might be named practical as distinct from theoretical history, unquote. So, according to Romein, we've got theoretical history in the middle, bordered by an Enlightenment era conception of the same, by philosophy of history, by historical technique, which may or may not be the same thing as historiography, and lastly, by practical history, which Romein calls pretty much likens to historiography. It's difficult to tell where exactly he sees the distinction. But as I just said earlier, Pocock found several different meanings of historiography. So there may be different tasks of historiography that border on theoretical history in different places and in different ways. They have different spots on the map, on the conceptual map of history. Romein notes that Dugald Stewart had used the term theoretical history in 1793, and Stewart did use theoretical history several times in his work, as when he wrote, quote, to trace the theoretical history of geometry, in which we know for certain that all the transitions have depended on reasoning alone, is a problem that has not yet been completely solved, unquote. Recall that during the same period, that is to say, during the Enlightenment, many called the work of Gibbon and Hume, and even Friedrich von Schlegel, philosophical history. And Stewart uses this as well. That is to say, he refers to philosophical history, though I couldn't find a place where he clearly distinguished between theoretical history and philosophical history. Stewart did imply that theoretical history eschews all metaphysics. So if it is allowed that philosophical history can abide metaphysics, then that is our differentia between the two. But again, I couldn't find an explicit passage in Stewart saying as much. I'd have to put a lot more effort to clarify Romein's logical geography of history, since each of the boundaries he cites for theoretical history themselves admit of logical geography, as I mentioned earlier in relation to Pocock's identification of several different tasks that could be called historiography. And Romein himself characterizes theoretical history in a variety of ways. In one place, he says that, quote, theoretical history aims at bridging the gap that divides the cautiously objective technique employed to ascertain the isolated facts of history and the arbitrary subjective method by which these facts are assembled into a picture of the past, unquote. But Romein also says that, quote, theoretical history deals with developments and concepts and establishes its case by comparing historical phenomenon and developments in different periods and places, unquote. So theoretical history itself has a logical geography, as these two characterizations of Romein are not necessarily distinct, but each could be practiced in isolation from the other, yielding two distinct theoretical histories. Another sense of the logical geography of history is that of the many ideas that a given historian weaves into his histories. In a review of Romein's posthumously published The Watershed of Two Eras, Europe in 1900, Martin C. Brands attributed 5 themes to Romein's historical work, being 1, dialectical progress in the law of the disadvantageous lead, 2, common human pattern and European deviations from it since the Middle Ages, 3, the theory that the great changes in history are achieved by upheaval or transformation from quantitative growth into qualitative change, 4, integrated historical writing, and 5, the synthetic concept of history which should follow from historical research. I've already mentioned the law of the disadvantaged leads. Brands connects this with the idea of what Elman Service called the law of evolutionary potential. Elman Service is best known for his taxonomy of early societies that developed from bands to tribes to chiefdoms and into states. And this is a form of cultural evolutionism, but unlike Marx's cultural evolutionism, it's concerned with the evolution of society and governance rather than with economic and technological evolution, as Marx is primarily concerned. Service also wrote a book with Marshall Sahlins, well-known anthropologist, titled Evolution and Culture, in which they formulated what they called the law of evolutionary potential, which they stated thus, quote, "The more specialized and adapted a form in a given evolutionary stage, the smaller is its potential for passing to the next stage. Another way of putting it, which is more succinct and more in conformity with preceding chapters, is specific evolutionary progress is inversely related to general evolutionary potential," unquote. So that's Service and Sahlins from their book, Evolution and Culture, on the law of evolutionary potential. And this isn't exactly the same thing as what Romein propounded as the law of the handicap of a head start, but we can see the formulation of Service and Sahlins as a more general and comprehensive version of pretty much the same idea. The common human pattern, that is the second thing that Brands cited as one of the themes of Romein, is the topic of one of the Romein papers that I haven't yet obtained. But Brands seems to point to a perennial way of life that would give rise to modern capitalism, indicating that Romein found this common human pattern exemplified in pre-modern Europe. We can think of this as the maturation of the perennial institutions of an agricultural civilization, bringing the civilization up to the point of transition to capitalism. And once again, this is a form of cultural evolutionism. The idea that the great changes in history are the result of transformation, again, this is Brand's third theme that he finds in Romein, the transformation from quantitative growth into qualitative change, we can understand as emergentism. That is to say that when a system becomes sufficiently complex, emergent properties appear so that quantitative change beyond a certain threshold results in qualitative change. I've previously discussed this in the episode on my paper, A Complexity Ladder for Big History, since big history particularly focuses on emergentism. The fourth theme that Brands finds in Romein is what he calls integrated historical writing. And Brands says of Romein on integrated historical writing, quote, "Romein was never able to accept the independence of historical specialisms, economic, social, political, cultural, or any other sort. Because of the division of historical knowledge, history has not fulfilled the social function which he thought it should," unquote. Romein himself, in his paper on theoretical history, wrote that his conception of theoretical history grew out of his critique of specialization in history. And he says, quote, "The progressive specialization of historical research constitutes a real threat to modern historiography, and itself deserves to be made the object of special investigation. It was to the study of this and allied problems that I first gave the name theoretical history. Further thought has convinced me, however, that this new discipline involves a much wider territory," unquote. From the integrated historical effort of his theoretical history would follow the elusive synthesis that so many historians have sought. And this is the fifth theme that Brands finds in Romein. And of this integrated historical synthesis, Brands writes, quote, "With his concept of the totality of history, Romein thought he could demonstrate the nature of the synthesis by choosing a limited period in which change manifested itself in all fields," unquote. And this was the occasion of Romein's posthumously published book about Europe in 1900. He was trying to bring all these 5 threads of thought together to give a total history of Europe in 1900. Of these five themes that Brands finds in Romein, we can remark that all but the first have come to be widely adopted, at least within certain communities, and the first was independently formulated by others. Romein also turned to non-Western history, writing The Asian Century, a history of modern nationalism in Asia. Given Romein's law of the handicap of a head start, and given Europe being the place where the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution originated, it's easy to see why Romein's attention turned to Asia. With industrialization beginning in Europe, Asia and the rest of the world stands to benefit from the converse of the law of the handicap of the head start, which is sometimes called the law of stimulative arrears. That is, if you're behind, that can be a source of stimulation for historical progress, if we want to invoke the concept of progress, which Romein does not, I have not found that in Romein, so that seems to be another thing off to one side. This argument has now made its way to the other side of the Atlantic, where the 20th century is sometimes referred to as the American century, serving as a proxy for Europe, you could say, and it's up for grabs who the 21st century belongs to. Romein's interest in identifying patterns in historical developments made him somewhat sympathetic to Toynbee. And being sympathetic to Toynbee made Romein the exception among historians and a target for criticism. The Dutch historian Peter Gale is known for his criticisms of Romein across several of his works, focusing on Romein's alleged Toynbeeism. Quote, Romein begins by admitting the difficulty. Our comprehension of history is subject to limitation. But in his craving for certainty, he has in his neo-Marxian philosophy found that useful ally, the zeitgeist. Curiously enough, Romein has been unable to resist the fascination of Toynbee, the prophet of Christianity. He has fallen for that glorious conception of the unity of mankind, universalist solidarity, as the philosopher of the Amsterdam school, Romein's friend Posse, has dubbed it, easily divesting it of its Christian garb and retaining the stark reality of one way of life enforced by one authority, unquote. While Gale's treatment of Romein verges on being abusive in some of his books, he has made some valid points. Although Romein doesn't call his efforts universal history, there are admittedly many universalist elements in it, among them those that Gale attributed to Romein. So perhaps we could say that the Enlightenment ideal of universal history would, in its maturity, become what Romein believed that theoretical history can be. Happy birthday, Jan Romein, and let me know what I missed or what I've gotten wrong in the comments, and thanks for listening.